Daniel had never imagined that his life would turn in such an unexpected way. He was not a warrior, not a commander, not even someone who dreamed of standing in the front lines of battle. He was simply a traveler, a man from Earth whose small ship had failed him far away from home. When his vessel had broken down near the colony of the alien people, he thought his stay would be temporary. He planned to repair what he could, trade for the parts he needed, and continue his journey quietly. But the universe had other plans for him. The colony was unlike any place Daniel had seen before. The structures rose tall and curved, built from metals that shimmered with colors unknown on Earth. The air carried the scent of burning minerals and the sound of a language that was sharp yet rhythmic. The alien people, proud and tall, moved with discipline. They were not unfriendly, but they were not warm either. To them, Daniel was a guest, perhaps even a curiosity, but never one of their own. Despite this, Daniel made himself useful. He had skills with machines, and though their technology was different from his curiosity and patience helped him learn quickly. He repaired broken generators, fixed farming tools, and adjusted engines that powered their transport. Slowly, some of the locals began to nod to him when he passed by, a small sign of acknowledgement that meant far more than words. He was not part of their world, but he was not entirely outside it either. Yet even as life settled into a rhythm, the shadow of war grew closer. Whispers ran through the colony of enemies from a rival clan preparing for an invasion. The people grew tense, their markets less lively, their warriors training with sharper intensity. Children were pulled inside earlier in the evenings, and smoke from the forges rose day and night as weapons were crafted. Daniel heard the whispers but thought little of them at first. Wars, he told himself, were the concerns of those who chose to fight. He was only a traveler. That belief shattered one morning when the guard commander himself came to him. The commander was a towering figure, dressed in black armor that seemed heavy even for his strong frame. His eyes were sharp, and his voice carried authority with every word. When he appeared at the workshop where Daniel was repairing a broken drill, silence spread through the gathered workers. No one ever saw the commander visit ordinary places. He belonged to the training grounds, the command halls, and the front lines, not the humble workshop. Daniel looked up, confused as the shadow of the commander fell across him. The workers bowed quickly, but Daniel, not used to such customs, simply wiped his hands and waited. The commander studied him for a long moment before speaking. His words were not a request, but a summons. The colony was preparing for war, and he wanted Daniel to stand with them. The room froze. Workers turned their heads, their eyes wide with disbelief. A human? A traveler? The idea seemed impossible. These warriors trained from birth, their bodies hardened, their minds disciplined. Daniel was none of these things. He had no weapon, no armor, no reason to be summoned. Murmurs filled the air, some amused, others angry. A few whispered that the commander must be testing him, perhaps even mocking him. Daniel himself was surprised, but inside him there was no hesitation. He looked at the commander, then at the workers around him. He understood what was being asked. To refuse would mean stepping away, leaving the colony to its fate. To accept meant stepping into a storm he had never trained for. And yet, he did not think twice. His answer came simply, firmly, without fear. "I will go." The words silenced the room. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the commander gave a single nod, as if this was the answer he had expected all along. He turned and left as suddenly as he had come, his cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. The workers stared at Daniel, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others watching with a hint of respect they had never shown him before. After the commander's departure, Daniel sat alone for a while. His hands still carried grease from the machine he had been fixing, but they trembled slightly now. He was not blind to the danger. He knew the enemies they faced were strong, that the battles ahead would test even the trained warriors of this colony. Yet there was no regret in his heart. He had lived among these people for months, walked their streets, eaten their food, and fixed their machines. They had given him shelter when his own ship had failed. How could he stand aside when they faced destruction? As the sun set that evening, Daniel looked out across the colony. The towers glowed in the fading light, their metallic edges catching the colors of the sky. Warriors trained in the open grounds, their weapons striking against one another with ringing sounds. Children clung to their mothers, watching the drills with wide eyes. The air was thick with both fear and determination. Daniel knew he was stepping into a world that was not his own, into a battle that was not meant for him. But he also knew that courage was not about where one came from, but about the choices one made when the moment arrived. And when the commander had called, he had answered without second thoughts. That single decision had already changed everything. When Daniel agreed to fight, he thought his real test would come on the battlefield, but he soon discovered that the training itself was its own kind of battle. The very next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he was taken to the warriors' grounds. The place was wide and open, with hard stone floors scarred from years of drills and practice. Tall figures in armor moved in perfect rhythm, their weapons clashing against each other in sharp strikes that echoed through the air. The sound was almost like thunder, steady and unrelenting. The guard commander stood at the edge, his gaze sweeping across his warriors. His voice carried authority as he barked orders, and instantly, hundreds of soldiers moved in unison. Daniel stood there, feeling out of place, his plain clothes and bare hands a clear contrast to the polished armor and weapons around him. Some of the warriors glanced his way, their expressions unreadable, though he could sense their doubts. To them, he was an outsider, untested and untrained. The commander called him forward, and silence spread through the crowd. He introduced Daniel not as a guest but as one of them, someone who would train beside them and fight with them. There was no ceremony, no grand welcome, only a direct statement that Daniel would stand as a warrior. Then, the training began. At first, Daniel struggled. The weapons they used were heavy, far heavier than anything he had ever held before. A sword that seemed light in the hands of an alien nearly dragged his arm to the ground. The shields they carried were thick and wide, built to withstand brutal strikes, but Daniel could barely lift one high enough to block. His first attempts at sparring ended quickly, with him knocked down again and again by warriors who barely seemed to use any effort. The others laughed quietly, though not cruelly, more in disbelief than mockery. To them it seemed obvious that this human could never match their strength. Even Daniel himself wondered if he had made a mistake. His body ached after only a short while, his arms burning, his legs shaking. But each time he fell, he forced himself to stand up again. He remembered his choice the moment he said yes without hesitation. That answer had not been given lightly, and he would not turn back now. Instead of trying to outmatch them in strength, Daniel began to pay attention to their movements. He watched the way they struck, the way they blocked, the way they left small gaps in their defense. He noticed how their size, while powerful, sometimes slowed their reactions. He began to test smaller movements, quicker dodges, sharper turns. At first it made little difference, but slowly, as days turned into weeks, he began to improve. The commander noticed. Where others saw a weak outsider, the commander saw determination. Daniel was not winning battles in training yet, but he was adapting. He lasted longer each day, dodged a little faster, and endured pain without complaint. The commander adjusted his training, pushing him harder, testing his limits. Daniel found himself running long distances with weights on his back, sparring with 2 opponents at once and practicing with weapons that felt unnatural in his hands. Every night he collapsed into bed exhausted, but every morning he rose again, ready to continue. Some warriors still doubted him, whispering that he would never survive the real fight. But a few began to respect his efforts. They noticed how he never gave up, how he treated training not as punishment but as a challenge. One of them, a young warrior named Lyron, even began sparring with him more gently, teaching him small tricks that others would not bother to explain. Lyron showed him how to shift his weight when blocking, how to angle his strikes to make the weapon feel lighter, and how to use his speed to turn the enemy's strength against them. Daniel listened carefully, absorbing every lesson. Despite the progress, the gap between him and the others remained wide. They were bred for battle, their muscles built from generations of training, their bodies naturally stronger than his. Daniel knew he would never match them in raw power, but he also knew something else: he could think differently. Where they followed long traditions of combat, Daniel experimented. He tried feints, sudden movements, and unexpected strikes. Sometimes he failed, earning bruises for his attempts, but sometimes he surprised even his teachers. One day, during a group spar, Daniel was cornered by 3 opponents. Instead of trying to overpower them, he used his smaller size to slip between their strikes, causing them to clash against each other. With quick steps, he managed to tap one of them on the side with his wooden practice sword before being taken down himself. The blow was light, almost meaningless in real battle, but the fact that he landed it at all drew murmurs from the watching warriors. For the first time, they saw that this human had something more than stubbornness. He had ingenuity. The commander's eyes narrowed with approval. He had taken a risk in summoning Daniel, but the risk was beginning to show its value. Where others saw only weakness, the commander saw potential. He did not praise Daniel openly, but in small gestures, a nod, a slight lessening of the harshness in his voice, the respect began to show. The days passed, and the air of the colony grew heavier. Rumors of the enemy's approach became more certain. Scouts returned with news of enemy camps gathering near the borders. The warriors trained longer, their voices louder, their weapons sharper. Daniel trained alongside them, sweating, bleeding, but never stepping away. By the end of the second month, the laughter that once followed his failures grew quieter. Fewer doubted him openly. He was still weaker than most, still far from their level, but he had earned something they valued: endurance, courage, and the will to stand even when knocked down. That, more than strength, was what kept him standing in their eyes. When he walked through the colony now, some of the people greeted him with nods, the same way they greeted their own warriors. Children no longer stared at him as a fragile outsider, but watched him with curiosity, as if he were becoming something greater. He was still Daniel, the human traveler, but he was also becoming Daniel, the warrior in training. And though the true battle had not yet come, something inside him was already changing. The days of repairing machines quietly were behind him. He had stepped into a new path, one carved not by choice alone but by responsibility. He no longer thought of himself as an outsider looking in. He was part of their struggle now, and he would face it with them, no matter the cost. The day everyone had been preparing for finally arrived. For weeks, the tension in the colony had grown heavier, like a storm cloud pressing down from the sky. Now, that storm had broken. The enemy came in numbers far greater than many had expected. Their ships appeared first, dark shapes cutting across the horizon, then filling the skies above the colony like a swarm of shadows. The ground shook with the sound of their landing crafts touching down, and the sharp cries of warning spread quickly through every street and hall. Daniel stood among the warriors as the alarm rang. The guard commander's voice carried through, the ranks steady and commanding even as danger pressed closer. The warriors formed their lines with practiced movements, shields locking together, weapons ready. The people of the colony who were not fighters hurried into shelters, their faces pale but trusting their defenders. Daniel's heart beat faster than it ever had before. Training had been one thing, but this was real. The enemy weapons glowed with power, their armor sharp and fearsome. From where he stood, he could see the determination and hatred on the faces of those who had come to attack. He knew that, if he made even the smallest mistake, it could mean death, not only for him but for those fighting beside him. Still, he did not step back. He tightened his grip on the weapon he had been given and adjusted the shield strapped to his arm. His decision had been made long ago. The first clash came quickly. The enemies rushed forward in waves, their battle cries loud enough to shake the air. The ground exploded with energy blasts and the sound of steel striking against shields. The line of defenders held, but the force of the impact made Daniel's arms tremble. He blocked one strike, then another, the weight of each nearly knocking him off balance. His body remembered the countless hours of training, and he forced himself to move the way he had practiced, dodging, angling, striking when he saw the smallest opening. At first, many of the enemy fighters ignored him, focusing on the larger and more threatening warriors around him. That gave Daniel a chance to study their movements. They were strong, but like his own allies, their size sometimes made them slower. He ducked under one strike, stepping sideways to avoid another, then drove his blade toward the joint of an enemy's armor. The blow was not powerful, but it was precise, enough to stagger the fighter and push him back. The warriors around Daniel began to notice. Where they had expected him to fall quickly, they instead saw him moving differently from the rest. He was not the strongest, but he was fast, and he struck at weak points that others did not see. When one of the alien defenders was nearly surrounded, Daniel rushed to his side, deflecting a strike that would have landed. Together, they pushed the attackers back long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Word spread quickly along the lines. The human was holding his ground. Some whispered in disbelief even as they fought, but the truth was there for all to see. Daniel did not hesitate, did not hide. He was in the front lines, fighting as if he had been born among them. The battle raged on, fierce and chaotic. Energy, blasts tore through the ground, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. Shields rang with the impact of heavy strikes. The cries of the wounded mixed with the shouts of warriors calling out orders and encouragement. Daniel's body ached with every movement, but his mind stayed sharp. He remembered the lessons he had learned during training, remembered the tricks that had once seemed small but now made the difference between life and death. At one point, Daniel and a group of warriors were cut off from the main line. Enemy fighters pressed in from three sides, their numbers overwhelming. Panic began to rise among the defenders, but Daniel shouted above the noise, his voice clear and steady. He ordered them to shift their shields and form a tighter circle, leaving no gaps. Surprised, the warriors obeyed, and together they held off the attackers. Daniel darted in and out, using his smaller size to slip through spaces the others could not. He struck at exposed joints, targeted weak spots, and forced the enemy back step by step. When reinforcements finally broke through to them, the group had not only survived, but had managed to hold their ground. The warriors looked at Daniel differently. Now, there was no longer doubt in their eyes, only respect. But the battle was far from over. The enemy seemed endless, wave after wave crashing against the defenders. The guard commander himself led charges, his presence like a pillar holding the line together. Daniel fought nearby, watching the commander's movements closely, learning even in the heat of battle. The commander's strikes were powerful, but more importantly, his courage never faltered. He stood where the fight was fiercest, and his warriors followed. Hours passed like this, every moment a test of will. Daniel's arms felt heavy, his shield dented, his blade nicked and worn. Sweat stung his eyes, and his breathing came in harsh gasps. Yet still he fought. Each time an enemy rushed at him, he pushed aside his exhaustion and moved. Each time he stumbled, he forced himself to rise again. There was no space in his mind for fear anymore, only determination. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows, across the battlefield the fighting slowed. Both sides had taken heavy losses. The ground was littered with broken weapons, shattered shields, and the signs of a day filled with blood and fire. The enemies pulled back, regrouping beyond the hills while the defenders stood weary but unbroken. Daniel lowered his shield slowly, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. Around him the warriors looked at him with something far stronger than curiosity. They had seen him fight. They had seen him stand when others might have fallen. Whispers passed among them, not of disbelief this time, but of pride. He knew this was only the beginning. The enemy would return, stronger and angrier. The battle ahead would be harder than anything they had yet faced. But in that moment, Daniel understood something important. He no longer stood among them as an outsider. He had fought in their lines, bled with them, and saved lives beside them. Whatever came next, he was no longer just the human traveler. He was one of their warriors. And though the war was far from over, the first clash had shown them all something they had not expected. The human could fight, and he would not falter. The days after the first clash were some of the hardest the colony had ever faced. The enemy did not retreat completely. They gathered in the distance, building new camps, preparing for another strike. The defenders knew they had survived one battle, but the war was not over. Every night the sound of distant drums and horns echoed from the hills, a reminder that the attackers were waiting, watching, and planning. The guard commander did not allow his warriors a moment of rest. He doubled the training, drilled them harder, and demanded constant readiness. Daniel trained alongside them, his muscles sore but his spirit unwilling to give up. The other warriors no longer doubted him as they once had. They sparred with him seriously now, offering him no mercy, treating him as one of their own. He welcomed it, knowing that the true test was still to come. Then, one dawn, the storm broke again. The enemy launched their largest attack yet. Ships filled the skies, blotting out the morning sun, and the ground shook as they landed in waves. The colony's alarms rang across every street, calling warriors to arms. Daniel rushed to the front lines, shield and blade in hand, his heart pounding. But steady, the battlefield was chaos. The attackers came in numbers greater than before, their weapons flashing with deadly light. The defenders held their lines, but the pressure was immense. For hours they clashed, neither side giving way. Daniel fought with everything he had, dodging, striking, moving swiftly through the madness. He no longer felt like an outsider in these moments. He fought as if the colony had always been his home. But then disaster struck. During a fierce push near the center of the field, the guard commander himself was caught in an ambush. Enemy warriors surged toward him from both sides, their weapons crashing down. He fought fiercely, striking them down with his powerful blade. But he could not block every attack. A heavy strike smashed into his side, breaking his armor and sending him sprawling to the ground. For a moment, the defenders faltered. The commander was more than just a leader. He was their strength, their courage, their guiding star. Seeing him fall sent a wave of fear through the lines. Some began to pull back, their shields wavering. The enemy saw the hesitation and pressed harder, sensing victory. Daniel saw it all happen. His chest tightened, his mind screaming at him to act. Without thinking, he rushed toward the fallen commander. He raised his shield just in time to block a strike aimed at the wounded leader, the force of it nearly knocking him off his feet. He shouted for help, calling 2 warriors to drag the commander back to safety. Then, standing in the gap that had been left, he lifted his weapon and faced the enemy head-on. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Daniel's voice rang out strong and clear above the noise of battle. He shouted orders, short, sharp commands that carried across the chaos. He told the warriors to tighten their ranks, to shift their shields, to strike not at the strongest points but at the weak spots. His voice was not filled with doubt or hesitation. It was steady, commanding, confident. At first, some hesitated. He was not their commander, not even one of their people by birth. But then they saw the fire in his eyes, heard the certainty in his tone, and they obeyed. The scattered warriors regrouped, forming a stronger line once more. Daniel moved among them, shouting, guiding, fighting alongside them without fear. The enemy pushed harder, but Daniel adapted quickly. He used everything he had learned from training and from the first battle. He ordered small squads to break away and target the enemy's supply carriers. He directed archers to focus on the attackers' legs and joints instead of their heavy armor. Slowly, the tide began to shift. The defenders, once faltering, began to push forward again. Daniel fought in the front, never asking anyone to do what. He himself would not. He deflected blows, struck when he saw openings, and rallied warriors who were on the edge of despair. His smaller size allowed him to move quickly, slipping between enemies and striking where they least expected. More than once he saved a warrior who had been surrounded, dragging them back to safety before rushing forward again. Hours passed like this, every second a struggle. The commander, carried back behind the lines, watched from where he lay wounded. He saw his warriors fighting not in chaos but with unity, their movements sharp and coordinated, and he saw Daniel at the center of it all. A human who had once been nothing more than a stranded traveler, now standing as the heart of the battle. When the enemy's supplies began to falter, their strikes grew weaker. Daniel pushed harder, rallying the defenders with every shout, every action. Together, they broke through the enemy's formation, driving them back toward the hills. The attackers retreated at last, leaving the field covered in wreckage and silence. As the dust settled, the warriors stood in disbelief. They had not only survived, they had turned the tide. And at the center of their victory stood Daniel, his armor dented, his body exhausted, but his spirit unbroken. The warriors raised their weapons in salute, a gesture of respect that few outsiders had ever earned. The guard commander, though wounded, was carried forward to witness it. He looked at Daniel, his eyes filled with something rare, pride. He gave a small nod, the kind that carried more meaning than words. Daniel had not just fought, he had led. And in that moment, the colony knew that their fate had changed. The battle was over, but its memory would not fade quickly. The ground was marked with scars from weapons and fire, the air still heavy with the smell of smoke. The people of the colony mourned those they had lost, yet there was also pride, a pride that grew stronger when they spoke of how they had turned the enemy back. And at the center of every story told, the human's name was spoken. Daniel tried to stay quiet after the victory. He did not seek attention, did not want to be treated as more than he was. To him, he had only done what was necessary, what anyone should do when their home, or the place they had chosen as their home, was under attack. But the colony did not see it that way. To them, he was no longer an outsider. He had fought as one of them, led them when their own commander had fallen, and carried them to victory. The guard commander, though still weak from his wounds, called for Daniel. When Daniel entered the chamber, the commander struggled to stand, but he stood nonetheless. With a slow, deliberate motion, he gave Daniel the warrior's salute. The gesture was simple, but everyone who witnessed it gasped. This salute was not given lightly. It was a mark of honor, a sign that someone was not just respected but accepted fully as one of their own. Daniel felt humbled. He bowed his head, unsure what to say. Words did not seem enough to answer the weight of such an honor, but the commander's expression told him that no words were needed. His actions had spoken louder than anything else ever could. In the days that followed, life in the colony began to settle again. The people rebuilt what had been broken, cared for the wounded, and prepared for whatever might come next. But wherever Daniel went, he was greeted with nods, with smiles, with words of thanks. Children pointed at him with wide eyes, telling stories of the human who fought like 10 warriors. Mothers spoke his name with gratitude, and soldiers clapped him on the back with pride. Daniel knew the war was not over. The enemy had been beaten back, but not destroyed. There would be more battles, more dangers, more tests. But he also knew that he would never face them alone. He had earned a place among the warriors, a place in the hearts of the people he had once thought of as strangers. For the first time since his ship had broken down, Daniel no longer thought of leaving. The colony had become more than a place of shelter. It had become his home. He had bled for it, fought for it, and stood shoulder to shoulder with its defenders. And in return, it had given him something he had never expected: belonging. The stories of his bravery spread beyond the colony. Messengers carried word to nearby settlements, and soon other people spoke of the human who had fought without fear, who had led warriors when their commander fell. Some did not believe the tales, thinking them exaggerated. But those who had seen Daniel fight knew the truth, and their voices carried weight. Daniel himself remained humble. He trained daily, sharpening his skills, learning new tactics. He knew that strength was not something one achieved once and kept forever. It was something that had to be built again and again every day, and though he had earned respect, he never let pride take root in his heart. He remembered always that he had been given a chance to stand with them, and he would never waste it. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with shades of red and gold, Daniel stood on the training grounds. The guard commander, still recovering but stronger each day, joined him. They stood in silence for a while, watching the younger warriors sparring. Finally, the commander spoke, his voice low but filled with meaning. He told Daniel that courage was not measured by bloodline or birth, but by choice. And when the time had come, Daniel had chosen to stand without fear. That choice, the commander said, had saved them all. Daniel listened, And in his heart, he felt the truth of it. He had not been born among them, but he had chosen to stand with them, and that, more than anything, had made the difference. From that day forward, whenever danger threatened the colony, the warriors did not look only to their commander for strength. They also looked to the human who had once been a stranger, but who was now one of their own. And Daniel, without hesitation, stood ready each time, just as he had from the very beginning, without second thoughts.